Yeah, so welcome. We're happy to have Jeremias Sulam speak today. He's an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he will tell us about the connection between testing and Shapley values. I'm very eager to hear what he has to say. Jeremias, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Suraj and Michal, everybody, for organizing and putting this together. I was super happy to learn that there was a seminar on theory for interpretability in ML a couple months ago. So it's really cool to be here and sharing this with you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the problems that we've been thinking about with my students over the last couple of years. And indeed, they are trying to get at the question of how should we test for notions of interpretability in a bit of a formal way. Now, I don't think I need to spend too much time to convince you that the implications of modern AI tools are really broad and far-reaching. They are sort of reshaping the way we understand game playing, the way we understand science and discovery, the way we solve very simple problems like matrix multiplications, or the way that we solve very complicated problems like folding long chains of amino acids into protein structures or developing chatbots. But I want to put forward a bit of a controversial. Oh, by the way, this is a cute piece of news. If you haven't seen it before, the Mathematical Olympiad Committee has a price of $10 million if one can develop a algorithm that can get gold in the mathematical Olympiads, an AI algorithm. So if you're looking for some grant money, if you want to partake in the competition, you could get a bunch of money. So let me, though, sort of kick things out by a bit of a controversial statement, which is this short excerpt from The Bitter Lesson by Rich Sutton, who many of you may know. I'm just going to read it out for you. So Rich writes, the biggest lesson that can be read from 70 years of AI research is that general methods that leverage computation are ultimately the most effective and by a large margin. Seeking an improvement that makes a difference in the shorter term, researchers seek to leverage their human knowledge of a domain, but the only thing that matters in the long run is leveraging computation. We want AI agents that can discover like we can, not those that contain things that we have already discovered. Now, I'm not advocating for this view. I'm not saying that this view is correct, in my opinion, but I think the one thing that is true about this statement is that inevitably we are ending up with algorithms that are performing really, really well and arguably better than any other humans have in the past. And it is a little bit unclear how is it that these systems can solve these tasks more efficiently than what we thought we could. And so you end up with this picture where you have very, very efficient machines solving problems, but it is unclear to us what is it in the data that has enabled them to find the solutions that they provide. And this is not just an intellectual problem, it is also a regulatory problem. So this is a screenshot of the presidential order from a couple of years ago from former President Biden on the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. Now, this presidential order has now been revoked under the new administration. But if you read it, there is a lot of language that basically advocates for the safe and secure use of AI, and trust and the opacity and complexity of these algorithms is really a big component of this. So there is a lot of interest at the regulatory level to try to understand reasons for algorithmic predictions. So what is interpretability in image classification? Just to get us closer to formalizing the problem. Let's say that you have these images. These are images of blood smears. These are microscopy images from drops of blood. And some of these drops of blood correspond to patients that are healthy and others patients that are sick. And so you can train algorithms that if you give it a new image, it will predict with very, very high accuracy whether this corresponds to a sick patient or a healthy subject. But what I would like to know is, is there something in this image that the algorithm is picking up on to tell me that this corresponds to a sick patient? And being just slightly more formal, I would like to understand if there's a subset of the input features so that if I condition somehow, and we will make this specific in a moment, If I condition on that subset C, maybe the function doesn't change too much. And I would like to understand what those features are. By the way, can you see my cursor? Okay, perfect. Okay, so by now there's, almost 8 years or so of literature on how to try to solve this problem or to try to tackle this problem. There are many ways to go about this. Some rely on notions of gradients and sensitivity analysis. There's a whole family of methods based on Shapley values. There are variational approaches. There are what some people call counterfactual explanations. By and large, in image classification, however, we are left with a picture like what you're seeing here, where pixels that are, in this case, have larger gradients are sort of broadcast to us in these sensitivity maps. And in this case, these pixels are highlighting where there is a person in the image because that's the label that we're trying to explain. And this somewhat conveys what parts of the image can be important, but as you can see, it's a little bit hand-wavy and it's a bit imprecise. And if we want to turn this into actionable decisions, we want to have more rigorous ways of defining these things. I should also say that for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking exclusively about post hoc interpretability methods. That is, we are going to try to be to try to run inference as to what features are important for a model after the model has been trained and given to us. Alternatively, you could try to pose this question by construction. You could try to make your model interpretable by construction. That's not what we are going to do today, although there are very interesting problems on that domain as well. Okay, so we are going to begin with Shapley values, and we will slowly move and progress towards asking questions of semantic importance. But just to bring everybody on board on what Shapley values are, these are concepts from game theory, which regard settings where we have a game that is parameterized by a set of players. I have n players here, and I have a characteristic function f that maps from the power set of the players to the real numbers. So this is just a function that tells me how well a given set of players did in a game. And it turns out that if you want to quantify how important each player in this coalition was towards the outcome of this cooperative game, and you want these notion of importance to satisfy specific axiomatic properties, then there's a unique form for those coefficients, and those are the ones that you see here. So for the player I, this Shapley coefficient is just the weighted sum of the marginal contributions, meaning I'm going to look at subsets Sj, all possible subsets of players that don't include the player I, and I'm going to play that game with subsets Sj and my player I, and I'm going to compare that outcome with playing the game only with my players in Sj. And I'm going to do this for all possible subsets Sj. And in the end, that's going to give me this value phi sub I. The W here is just a coefficient that is fixed. You shouldn't worry about it. So this is nice, as I said, because it satisfies some axiomatic properties. So we know something about these things. Although, as you can probably imagine, if I'm exploring all possible subsets, there are exponentially many of those that I need to explore. And so in general, computing these things is going to be intractable. Now, that, Shapley values is a notion of game theory. We are talking about machine learning predictors. And so it's a little bit unclear how one should map those concepts that talk about cooperative games to predictors. And so in our setting, what we are going to have is some features in our N. We're going to restrict ourselves to binary responses, although this is not necessary. And we're going to have a predictor that we're going to assume it's good enough, but I'm going to assume nothing about it. So you could think of this as giving you something like the conditional expectation, but it need not be. All I know is that I have a function from x to y. So with these elements, a central notion is the one that I'm defining here as x tilde s, because you need to ask yourselves, these Shapley coefficients rely on subsets of players. So you need to be able to play again with a subset of players. So here, if we have a predictor acting on certain features, it's a bit unclear what does it even mean to apply a predictor to a subset of features. And so what we're going to do is, for any subset of players or features S, and if someone gives me a fixed sample X, I'm going to construct a random variable, X tilde sub S, where the S entries are fixed and given by the sample that I was shown. And the complement is sampled from the corresponding conditional distribution of the data. So in other words, or pictorially, if someone gives me a sample X, I want to study, for example, conditioning on these subsets S. And then what I can do is sample a bunch of random variables that share the same S features, and the rest come from the corresponding conditional distribution of the data. So throughout the talk, I'm going to assume that I can sample from this distribution. And you might argue that this is very strong, particularly for high-dimensional the distributions that live on a high-dimensional space. But I would argue that in practice, we are getting to the point where doing this is kind of reasonable. So here's an example. Here's an image X, and here is a subset of features, smile, that I want to condition on. And now I want to sample from the conditional distribution of the data, condition on the subset S. And here you see these samples, right? These are samples that share the subset of the smile, but they are random variables. And by the way, I should stress, feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm happy to stop. Okay, so with these definitions of random variables, then one way of extending this idea of Shapley values to the context of predictors in this statistical setting is to say, well, I'm going to evaluate my predictor in these random variables, and then take an expectation, because these are going to be random numbers now. And this is going to be my Shapley value to attribute importance to each of my input features. And this was introduced by Scott Lundberg and Soon Lee from a few years ago. It has become very, very, very popular. So here are 3 guiding questions that we are going to answer hopefully throughout today. The first one is, I just showed you that computing these things requires an exponential number of subsets, and so this is going to be intractable. So the first question you may want to ask is, can we resolve this computational bottleneck? Are there settings where we can actually do better, not in exponential time? The second is, what are we actually doing when we take an idea from game theory and apply it to predictors, to machine learning predictors? I mean, what does it even mean statistically? And lastly, this will take us to understand how we could phrase these questions of importance. And in particular, we are going to do it in the context of semantic explanations. We're going to go beyond input features. Okay. So let's start with the first question, which is going to be quite simple. So here's an assumption that in the beginning is going to appear pretty strong, but I hope to convince you that it's actually not too big of a big deal in a bunch of different settings. So what I'm going to assume is that my function, the one that I'm explaining, in this binary setting is going to predict 1 if and only if there exists a feature that totally determines my response. So this notation, what this means is that I'm conditioning on the feature I. The rest is sampled from the conditional distribution of the data. What I'm saying is the function will be 1 if there exists a feature that, if I have it, the response will inevitably always be 1. And this is a very natural assumption. Indeed, this is for example, in the case that I showed you before, that is exactly true. So in this case, what distinguishes sick patients from healthy subjects is actually the presence of specific cells that have been infected. So the presence of an infected cell entirely determines the response. And more generally, the same is true if you're, for example, looking at image classification where the class is determined by the presence of an object, right? If I'm classifying dogs versus cat, as long as I have a dog in the picture, then what I'm assuming is that the label will inevitably be dog, regardless of what else I can paint in the background. So that's the assumption. Under this assumption, turns out you can do a lot better than just naively compute Shapley coefficients, because you can do the following. Here I have a feature which is, it's an 8-dimensional feature. I have 2 of these important features, and therefore the response is 1. But if the assumption is true, what I can do is, instead of playing an 8-player game, I could just divide this in 2 parts, and I'm going to play this 2-player game. And I'm going to ask, is any of these 2 players important? In this case, the answer will be yes, because these both halves contain an important feature. And I can cascade this process forward. In this case, this player is not going to be deemed important. This one will. And I can construct this hierarchical partition. And importantly, at every level of the hierarchy, I am only playing a game, a cooperative game, with a very small number of players. So this is a sort of a proof sketch of this theorem that I'm showing you here, which shows that this hierarchical version of Shapley that we called HShap, first of all, it doesn't run in exponential time anymore, it runs in linear time. And under the assumption that I presented, you lose nothing. In other words, you can recover the original Shapley values that you would have computed had you run the Shapley game on the original input space, but you do it in this hierarchical way much faster. So this not only sort of works in theory, it works in practice pretty nicely too. So what you're seeing here is, on the left, you have images of patients' blood smears. The green boxes indicate where the ground truth important cells are, the ones that are infected. And here you have a bunch of different explanation methods. HShap is this hierarchical Shapley that I'm talking about. And you see that most often than not, HShap finds the important cells. Lime and GradCam are kind of like lighting up everywhere. And gradient exp and deep exp are 2 variations of Shapley values that try to compute these coefficients, which, again, in general is intractable by basically subsampling and doing other approximations. But in these images, they're pretty large. These approximations really just don't work. And so we don't see anything coming out. You can quantify this too. So here what you have is F1 score as a function of the runtime for different problems. And in general, what this shows is that HShap is very accurate in retrieving the important features. So the F1 is very high and is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude faster than the other versions that try to approximate Shapley values. So the bottom line from this is that imposing these assumptions on the distribution does help a lot. And for these kind of settings, it's not too strong of an assumption to make. Okay, this kind of works. And when we were done with this, we were like, okay, this is, in practice, this is nice, but it's felt also a little bit unsettling because it's a bit unclear. The second question that I presented before, which is, what are we actually doing? I mean, these Shapley values are a way of assigning importance to players in a cooperative game, but features that are input to a predictor are not playing any game. And so it's a bit unclear what this attribution really means. So what I'm going to show you now is a way of linking the Shapley values with other notions of feature importance that are better known and better understood. So what we are going to do is look at notions of conditional independence. So for example, one way of deeming a feature important is to pose a null hypothesis. I'm going to say that my null hypothesis for a subset S is that my features in XS are independent of the response, conditioned on having observed all other features. Right? And so this kind of makes sense, because this means that the moment I observe the rest, there's nothing new that I need to know about my response from the features in XS. And so if I manage to reject this null hypothesis, I'm going to deem my features S as important. Otherwise, I fail to reject. So what we are going to do is basically take inspiration from this framework of posing interpretability and feature importance in terms of hypothesis testing. And we are going to present here a local version of this feature importance. And so what we're going to do is the following. For any subset of features S without I, if you give me a sample X, my null hypothesis for feature I with respect to subset S is that if I condition on my features in S and I evaluate the response of my predictor, remember, this is a random variable, and so this induces a distribution after I push it forward through the predictor. If I condition on S and I versus if I condition only on S, I'm going to say that these distributions are the same. If this is true, then I'm going to argue that according to this definition, I is not important with respect to subset S. So here's another visual example as to why this definition might make sense. Let's say that here I want to run this hypothesis test where my feature I is this quadrant, which has the important cell, but I don't know it. The predictor doesn't know this in advance, of course. And the subset S is looking at quadrants 1, 3, and 4. So I'm going to evaluate this left-hand side. Here, I'm conditioning on S and I. So I'm conditioning on all 4 quadrants. If I'm conditioning on all 4 quadrants, there's no more randomness here. This is just fixed. And therefore, this distribution is a delta at 1, because this is saying, yes, there is some infected cell here. Now, if I compare it to this side, here I'm only conditioning on S, which is quadrants 1, 3, and 4. But the second quadrant is going to be sampled at random. And therefore, sometimes there will be a cell, sometimes there will not be a cell. But definitely that distribution is no longer going to be a delta at 1. And therefore, this null that I have here will not be true. I will reject it. And I will conclude that this quadrant is indeed important for the prediction, because indeed, in this case, contains the 6th cell. So it turns out that we do have a procedure to test for this that I'm not presenting to you here, but you should just know that there is a little algorithm that assumes that we can sample from these conditional distributions. And if that is true, then we return that this procedure returns a p-value that is a valid p-value for this test. In other words, we can use this p-value to reject this null with, for example, controlled type 1 error. Okay, why am I telling you all this if we were talking about Shapley values until now? The reason I'm telling you this is for the following. Here's the same null. I haven't changed anything. This is the same null for importance. And here is a definition of Shapley coefficients that I presented before. Nothing has changed. This is the Shapley coefficient for feature I with respect to subset S. Now, compute the expected p-value from the test that I just presented to you, and let's call that PIS. And look at this little term here. Let's call that gamma IS. It turns out that the p-value, the expected p-value of the procedure that tests for this null hypothesis is upper bounded by 1 minus this term, which is this gamma IS. So why is this at all interesting? Well, what this says is that whenever the Shapley value is large, which means that these things are close to 1, that implies that the p-value for this null hypothesis is going to be very close to 0. And therefore, you should expect to reject it. So from this perspective, these Shapley coefficients then do carry a very precise statistical meaning. In other words, high Shapley values allow you to reject null hypotheses for this notion of feature importance. Okay. Okay, great. So let's move on to the third question, which is fine. What do we know now? We know that putting some distributional assumptions about the data helps in computing Shapley values. We also know that Shapley values are related to some notion of statistical feature importance, in the sense that large Shapley values imply rejecting a null hypothesis for a specific notion of importance. But all of this was for input features. And that is inevitably very limiting. So what we would like is to extend these ideas to semantic notions. So for example, if I have here a picture, this is a picture of my cat, and I have some black box predictor that is telling me that, yes, the probability of being a cat here is actually the greatest. I want to understand what input features are important for this prediction, but importantly, I don't want my input features just to be the input pixels. I want an explanation that talks about some kind of semantic content. For example, I would love to ask the question, is the piano, right? Is the fact that there's a piano here in the image important for the predictor telling me that it is a cat, given that I already see that there's a cute mammal in the picture? Maybe the piano is irrelevant in that sense. So I would like to ask these questions, but in terms of semantic concepts as opposed to in terms of input features like we did before. So to do this, we need to get a hold of something that quantifies something about the semantic content of the input images. And this is something that has been explored in the past. The standard way to do this is to say, well, I'm going to have a model, and I'm going to assume very little about my model. The only thing I'm going to assume is that I have some encoder, and I have access to some embedded space, some representation space, on which a classifier is then acting and making a prediction. And I'm going to assume that I have access to this embedding space. And in particular, these semantics are going to be given by linear functions of my embedded vectors. So what I mean by this is that we will have vectors that represent concepts, for example, the concept piano, the concept cute, the concept whiskers. And then I'm going to compute inner products between these concept vectors and these features to gauge the amount of concepts that is present in these features. So we will have these features living in RD, and I will simply compute the semantics by inner products of these semantic concepts with the embeddings H. Here it's a capital because it's a random variable. Okay, the question is how could you access these kind of concept vectors? I mean, it sounds weird that you should be able to capture these very complicated semantic notions by just a vector in RD. So there's a couple of ways of how to do this. Bin Kim and collaborators in 2018, they proposed this idea of concept activation vectors, which is a very simple but efficient idea, which is to say, well, if you have a bunch of examples that, for example, have things that are cute and do not have things that are cute, well, then I can just push them through my encoder and then look at these representations in this embedded space and then train, for example, a linear classifier on this embedded space to tell me in what direction concepts are cute versus not cute. And you can do this, and this works quite all right. But of course, this requires for you to have access to a bunch of examples that have concepts that are cute and other concepts that are not cute. More recently, you can use vision language models, CLIP and the like. And these are very nice because these have been trained already in a way that, in such a way that both the image encoder and the text encoder match or have a high inner product based on their semantic content. And amazingly, to at least to people who work in theory, these kind of representations make a lot of sense. In other words, they work really well in characterizing how certain concepts are present in different images. And this is because these models have been trained via contrastive learning and through matching captions and images very, very extensively. And we have access to these models. So for the majority of the work that I will describe next, we will be using these vision language models. So how do these concepts look like? Well, they look like what you would expect. In other words, here you have, for example, a picture of an English Springer. I can push it through my encoder, and then I can compute these inner products with all of these concepts that I can query because I can just push them through the language encoder in my vision language model. And if you compute these inner products, you will see that they make sense, in the sense that the ones that have higher inner product are the ones that have concepts that are most present, more or less, in these images. So for example, for the English Springer, you see that the Spaniel has a very large inner product. Flew, because it's flying, has a high inner product. In church, you see exterior, cathedral, trumpet. In the gas pump, you see dispenser, obsolete. So these kind of make sense. But what we want to do is use these ideas of these semantic projections, but turn them into notions of semantic importance that we can test for in a formal way. I should also say that a standard way that people have been thinking about these things is through concept bottleneck models that you might have heard of, which, in principle, they attempt to do very similar things. So the idea is that I'm going to query these semantic concepts on this embedded space, but then one can train a linear predictor on these semantic concepts directly. And therefore, the model that you end up with is interpretable because it's just a linear combination of concepts that are present in your image. But it has a couple of downsides. One downside is that if you want these predictions to be accurate, then you need a very large concept bank. You need these representations to be very, very large. And second, this kind of defeats the purpose of trying to understand and interpret the original predictor that was given to us. This is finding a surrogate linear model on these semantic concepts, which is not what we wanted. We wanted to be able to use and analyze the original model that was given to us, the composition of F and G. So this is, if I put everything together that I've said so far, what we would like is a method that works entirely on an off-the-shelf predictor that someone gives me, as long as I have access to this embedded space. We want to turn these inner products into precise notions of feature importance, and we want these to be global and local, and I will explain what this means in a moment. And we also want to be able to test for pretty arbitrary concepts that we can just think about, and I don't want to have to worry about collecting a very large concept bank or anything of that nature. And of course, we want this to rely on specific testing procedures that have precise statistical guarantees. So I would like to, for example, have control type 1 errors or false discovery rate control. So the way to do that is to go back to our notions of independence that I just presented before. So for example, globally, I could ask that I want my label Y to be independent of a specific concept zj. So zj could be whiskers, for example, and maybe I want the prediction of cat to be independent of whiskers. That might be pretty weak. I mean, all these concepts in practice are very correlated, and so you will reject this kind of null. So then you could look at global condition and conditional importance or conditional independence. Maybe whiskers is independent of the label cat if you observed all of the other things, like there's a cute mammal with fur and small. And I would like, by the way, I should also stress, all of these are random variables, and the randomness here comes from the input features x. So I'm just writing here y and z as shorthand notation, but keep in mind that all of these things are functions of the random features x. These tests that I just described are global notions of importance because they were over the population. But I could also ask questions locally. So for this given image that we are looking at here, someone gave me this image, and now I want to ask these questions of semantic importance for this given instance. If that's the case, then we can pose a similar null hypothesis to the one that we saw before in the context of Shapley values. But now this is going to be a null in this semantic space. So in other words, what this is asking is, if I sample H are the embedded vectors. If I sample these embedded vectors, having conditioning on having observed a certain amount of concepts, S and J, and I push them through my classifier, I want that output to be the same in distribution as the predictions that I would get if I were conditioning only on subsets S. So what I'm saying is that adding another concept doesn't change the predictor in distribution. Here is perhaps a more telling example. So here there's an image. The label is a gas pump. Okay, so the y hat is gas pump. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the J concept to be dispenser. And the S subset is going to be something else. Like, for example, it could be old and some other features, some other concepts. If I compare the distributions of the outputs of my classifier, when I condition only on S versus when I condition on S and the concept dispenser, you see that the moment I add the concept dispenser, this distribution shifts to the right, which makes sense because this is saying, well, if you observe the concept dispenser, the classifier is more likely to predict that this is indeed a gas pump. And so if I manage to measure somehow the difference between these two distributions, I will be able to reject this null hypothesis and then conclude that indeed the concept dispenser is important for this prediction with respect to the subsets S. And conversely, if you condition on something that is not important, then this won't happen. So here, instead of conditioning on the concept dispenser, I condition on the concept trumpet. And adding the concept trumpet doesn't change this distribution at all. And so then I will conclude that trumpet is not important for this prediction. And so this, I hope, conveys the picture of how to frame these questions. And now you're left with three notions of testing for semantic importance. One is globally over the population and only asks for independence between predictions and these semantic concepts. Another one is also global, but asks for conditional independence. And the last one is this local version, where we are asking for similarity in distributions after we condition on specific concepts. And this is just to show you that these tests for independence or conditional independence can just be turned into two sample tests that we know a lot about. So what we are going to do now in the next 5 minutes or so is to just present to you methods to test for these null hypotheses. So what is the standard way to go about this? Well, I have a null hypothesis and I want to test it at some significance level alpha. Then one traditional way to go about this is to collect data. We have our null. You collect your data, you perform a test, and then you reject if the evidence that you observed reflected by this p-value is small enough. Alternatively, what you could do, which is what we do in our work, is to rely on e-values instead of p-values. So e-values are different notions of random variables that allows us to reject in a much more flexible manner. And in particular, I can compute these e-values in an online manner and then reject at any time whenever these e-values grow above a certain level, as opposed to using a p-value that has to be small enough. And I will show you exactly how to construct these e-values in a moment. What we're going to do is construct a stochastic process that will reflect a game or a wealth process. So you start with a value of 1. You could think of this as having $1. And then iteratively, over many rounds, you are going to pick a betting fraction, an amount of money that you want to bet. You're going to bet against the null, and then the world or the environment is going to reveal the truth to you. And with that payoff, you're going to update your wealth. And the whole point of this is that if this wealth process is fair, that means that in expectation, the value of this payoff is going to be 0 under the null. So under the null, you will never be able to accumulate any wealth. Which is nice, because if that's true, then you can use this wealth process as a test martingale, and then you can use it to test for your null. In other words, you will know that the probability that there exists a time at which the wealth grows above 1 over alpha is actually bounded by alpha. So what that means is that we can monitor this wealth process, and under the null, this will never, this will in expectation remain bounded. And only if the null is not true, the wealth will grow, and you can use it to reject the null with control type on error. So that's what we're going to do here. The only thing that I need to tell you is you need to be able to pick a betting function, and you need to be able to pick a payoff function. The way we do it is we basically follow this idea of sequentialized kernelized independence testing. For the betting function is less important. For the payoff function, you want to use a function that looks antisymmetric like this. Rho here can be any function that you want, but you want this to have a high value under the alternative so that you have high power. In particular, we used the MMD, the maximum mean discrepancy, and there's a further technical details that I can go in later. But the important thing that I want to convey is the reason we take this approach of online testing instead of just testing by p-values is for 2 important reasons. First, this is a lot more data efficient, so I can monitor this process in an online manner. And what do I need to test for this? I need to sample from these distributions. If I were using p-values, I would need to sample a bunch of data and then test. In this way, I can test as I go, as I sample. And therefore, I only need to sample as much data as I need to reject. If at some point I rejected, I don't need to continue sampling anymore. And therefore, this is a lot more data efficient. And second, the time at which I reject, this rejection time, actually induces an order of importance, which I cannot necessarily do with p-values. So what I'm going to show you now is that you can rank concepts by ordering of importance depending on how fast these tests reject. So here's a little example on an image from ImageNet. So here you have the label, you have an image with a label of French horn. What I'm doing is testing for these notions of importance that I just showed you. And I'm computing the rejection time here on light blue, and the rejection rate, the number of times that the null rejects in this dotted line. And these are ordered according to their rejection time. So you see that the concepts that reject the fastest are the ones that are, according to this definition, the most important. So brass, trumpet, instrument, etc. And what I want to stress is that these tests that we are having, if we now take these and sort of report them as important, these decisions that we're making come with these guarantees of type 1 error control. We can guarantee that we're not going to be rejecting incorrectly more than alpha% of the time. And moreover, we can actually control for these and also give you false discovery rate control over the features that we are deeming important. You can do many other cool things. For example, you can find things that are a little bit peculiar. So here, for example, if you have two dogs, you see that the first concept that is important for this model is the concept spaniel, which makes sense because it's a Cocker Spaniel, I guess. But also the concept sibling is also pretty high up because there are two dogs instead of one. Or here, for example, there's a dog and fetch is there, but also fishing is there because maybe the dog is in the water and therefore the concept fishing can be relevant. We actually, my student Jacopo, he put together a demo on Hugging Face where you can directly load up any vision language, a subset of vision language models, and you can upload your own picture and you can test for whatever concept you want. And it will run these tests in the background and it will give you this ranking of importance. And this is nice because you don't need to train any model. There's a very lightweight sort of sampler that runs in the background testing for these things, but it allows you to compute these tests pretty efficiently. You can also do more interesting things. You can use it to vet models. So for example, here we are in a setting where we do know, we have a notion of ground truth features that are present in this image. So for example, here there's a blue jay, and we know from experts that blue jays have a blue forehead, a blue crown, a blue undertail, a gray breast, etc. Now, the model that is making a prediction what kind of bird this is knows nothing about these features. Yet we can test for whether these features that the experts tell us are important, whether they are important for the model. And you see that indeed, all of these are deemed important according to the definitions that I presented before, with the exception of the size. So the size for this specific model was not important to make the prediction that this picture corresponds to an image of a blue jay. You can use it to vet many other kinds of models. So here I have a case of predicting whether a specific scanned brain CT has or has not the presence of a brain hemorrhage. And you can sort of start querying, instead of concepts, different subtypes of brain hemorrhage. And you can use it to vet whether the models that are indeed flagging certain things as having hemorrhage have the correct type, are detecting the correct type of brain hemorrhages. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. So just to conclude, I'll also mention that being able to query what concepts are important for different models, and in particular for different vision language models, is nice because it allows you to compare models as well, right? These models are very diverse, they're very different, it's kind of unclear how you can compare them. Well, this gives you sort of a way of comparing a dimension, which is what concepts do they find important for making predictions? And so in the paper, we have a section that looks at comparing a bunch of different models according to what concepts they find important. So just to conclude, and going back to these definitions of Shapley values, they are in general intractable to compute, but you can often put distributional assumptions about the data that make them tractable. They are related to specific statistical notions of importance and via these null hypotheses. And you can extend these null hypotheses for importance to these semantic concepts that I presented in the last part. Everything that I talked about is work led by Jacopo Teneggi, who's a PhD student in my lab, as well as Bipul, who's also with us, and Yaniv Romano, who's at the Technion. And I'll be happy to take questions if there are any.